The dragons of the Drakvas clan were not gentle with their prisoners. When they dragged Garrett through the gates of their mountain stronghold, every dragon who saw him expected the same thing they always saw: a frightened human, wide-eyed and pale, already halfway broken before a single word had been spoken. It was always the same. The size of the walls alone was usually enough. The smell of smoke and old stone. The sound of heavy wings overhead. By the time most prisoners reached the lower cells, they were already begging. Garrett looked around at the stronghold with mild curiosity, the way a man looks around a town he has never visited before. His hands were bound. There were 4 armed dragon warriors surrounding him, each one twice his height and carrying weapons that could have ended him without much effort. He took it all in quietly, said nothing, and walked where they pushed him. The cell they put him in was deep in the mountain. Stone floor, stone walls, stone ceiling. A small iron-barred window high on one wall let in a thin strip of gray light. There was a pile of rough cloth in the corner that was meant to serve as a bed, and a clay bowl of water near the door. That was everything. The 4 warriors threw him inside, and the iron door slammed shut behind him with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. 2 of them stayed outside the bars, arms crossed, watching him. They were waiting for the reaction. The collapse. The first flood of tears, or the desperate rattling of the bars, or the shouted promises of ransom. Garrett stood in the center of the cell for a moment. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the cloth in the corner. Then he walked over, picked it up, shook the dust off it, folded it into a rough square and set it back down. He sat on it, rested his back against the cool stone wall, put his arms on his knees and closed his eyes. The 2 guards looked at each other. He was asleep within minutes. By the next morning the guards had changed, but the story had not. The new pair arrived expecting to find a prisoner who had spent the night in quiet misery, staring at walls and jumping at sounds. Instead they found Garrett on the floor of his cell doing push-ups in slow, steady sets. He was counting under his breath. He had already lost count twice and started over, which did not seem to bother him at all. When the morning food came, a hard piece of dark bread and a bowl of something gray and thick that the dragons fed their lower-ranked prisoners, Garrett took it without complaint, sat back down and ate every bit of it. He did not make a face. He did not push it away. He finished it, set the bowl near the door, and drank half the water they had left him. The guard who brought the food had expected complaints. Most humans found dragon prison food nearly impossible to eat. She stood outside the bars for a moment watching him finish it, then took the empty bowl and left without speaking. Word moved through the stronghold the way word always moves through a place where many people live in close quarters, quickly and with details added at every step. By midday, the warriors in the upper halls had heard that the human prisoner was behaving strangely. By evening, the story had reached the senior warriors. By the time the night watch began, it had reached the ears of the clan matriarch herself. Mora was not a dragon who was easily surprised. She had lived for a long time and seen a great many things. She listened to the report from her head guard with an expression that gave nothing away, then asked a single question. "Has he said anything?" The guard thought about it. "He said good morning to the dawn watch." Mora looked at the guard for a moment. Then she told her to double the watch on his cell and report anything unusual. On the 3rd day, 2 of the largest warriors in the clan came to Garrett's cell just before midday. They were chosen for this task specifically. They were the kind of warriors who made the ground feel different when they walked on it, heavy and certain and final. They had broken the composure of prisoners before, sometimes without even touching them. They simply arrived, and the fear that came with them arrived first. They stopped outside the bars and both slammed their fists against the iron at exactly the same moment. The sound rang off the stone walls and down the corridor and came back again, and it was the kind of sound that hit a person somewhere low and instinctive, somewhere the body kept its fear whether the mind wanted to or not. Garrett was in the middle of a set of push-ups. He did not stop. He did not flinch. His rhythm did not change even slightly. He counted to 10 under his breath, finished the set, and then sat back on his heels and rolled his shoulders once. He picked up the small piece of bark he had been using to scratch tally marks, counting his sets, and added a mark. Then he looked up at the 2 warriors. They were staring at him. He looked at them the way a person looks at someone they have seen somewhere before but cannot quite place. Easy. Unbothered. Present. Morning, he said. Neither warrior said anything. One of them opened his mouth, then closed it again. The other shifted his weight slightly, which for a dragon of that size was a surprisingly uncertain movement. They left. The smaller of the 2, though smaller was a relative word, stopped at the end of the corridor and looked back once. The human had already gone back to his push-ups. The senior warrior reported to Mora that evening and did not seem entirely comfortable doing it. He said that the prisoner had not reacted. He said he had tried twice to describe what had happened and both times the description had not felt right. Mora asked him what the prisoner had said. "Good morning," the warrior said, and then looked like he wished he had said something else. Mora sat with that for a moment. Then she called for her daughter. Saravan arrived with the quiet certainty she brought to most things. She was the best warrior in the clan and she knew it, not in an arrogant way but in the practical way of someone who had tested the fact repeatedly and found it to be true. She stood before her mother and listened without interrupting as Mora explained what had been reported. The prisoner did not react to fear. Did not beg. Did not break. Did not complain about his food or his cell or his situation. He ate, slept, and exercised with the steady patience of a man who had somewhere comfortable to be inside his own head regardless of what was happening outside it. Saravan listened. Then she asked what she was being sent to do. Mora said she wanted her to go and look at him. To assess him. To find out what kind of creature this was, because in 60 years of running this clan she had not had a report quite like this one, and she did not like things she did not understand. Saravan went the next morning. She arrived at the cell just after midday, when the thin strip of light from the high window was at its longest. She stood outside the bars and looked in without announcing herself. Garrett was sitting against the far wall. He had a piece of bark in his hand and he was folding it slowly into a shape. Something small, something deliberate. He had not heard her come, or if he had not reacted to it. Saravan watched him for a moment. He was smaller than she expected. Not small. He was a large human, broad across the shoulders, and the past 3 days of exercise in a stone cell had not dulled anything about the way he held himself. But he was smaller than the reputation that had built around him in 3 short days felt like it should be. He looked up. He found her immediately, which meant he had known she was there. He had simply waited. He looked at her with clear, calm eyes and said nothing, waiting to see what she would do first. Saravan said, "You are not afraid." It was not a question. She had meant it to be an observation, something to push against, something to get a reaction from. It came out flatter than she intended. Garrett tilted his head slightly. "I didn't say that," he replied. His voice was even. Unhurried. "I just don't see how falling apart helps anything." Saravan looked at him for a long moment. The bark shape in his hand she realized was a small folded bird. She turned and walked away without another word. That evening she stood before her mother and gave her report. Mora asked what she had found. Saravan was quiet for a moment longer than usual. "He is either the bravest creature alive," she said finally, "or the most dangerous." Saravan told herself the second visit was official business. She had a reason prepared. She was going to ask the prisoner about the border skirmish that had led to his capture. Troop numbers, patrol routes, supply lines. Useful information. The kind of thing a clan heir was supposed to gather. She had the questions lined up in her head before she even reached the lower corridor. She arrived at the cell and Garrett looked up from the floor where he was sitting and said nothing, just waited. She asked none of her prepared questions. Instead she stood outside the bars for a moment, looking at him, and then said, "How are you sleeping down here?" It was not what she had planned to say. She was not entirely sure why she said it. It came out before she had properly decided to speak. Garrett considered the question as if it were a reasonable one, which in the circumstances it was not particularly. "Fine," he said. "Stone is cold but I've slept on worse." Saravan nodded once as if this was the information she had come for. Then she left. She reported nothing to her mother because there was nothing to report. The third visit she did not bother preparing a reason. She came in the late afternoon when the stronghold was busy and no one was paying particular attention to where she was going. She told herself she was checking that the watch rotation was being handled properly in the lower cells. This was technically within her responsibilities as clan heir. She did not examine the thought too closely. Garrett was doing slow stretches when she arrived, working through what looked like a careful routine, each movement deliberate and unhurried. He glanced at her when she appeared and then finished the stretch he was in the middle of before straightening up. "Back again," he said. Not pointed. Not a challenge. Just a simple observation, the way you might note that it was raining. "I oversee the lower watch," Saravan said. "Sure," said Garrett. There was a pause. Saravan looked at the wall to the left of him, which had nothing on it. "What were you doing?" she said. "Stretching." He rolled one shoulder back slowly. "If I stop moving properly in here my back will lock up. Then I'll be useless when I get out." Saravan looked at him. "You are confident you will get out?" He smiled slightly. It was a small and genuine thing, not a performance. "I'm confident it's worth behaving as if I will." She left 12 minutes later. She came back the next day. By the 5th visit she had stopped tracking her reasons entirely. She stood at the bars, they talked. It was a simple pattern and she did not inspect it. What she noticed, and tried not to notice, was that Garrett never asked her for anything. Most creatures in a cell asked for things. Better food, more light, word sent to someone outside. Garrett asked for nothing. He did not ask her to carry messages. He did not ask her to argue his case to the matriarch. He did not ask for any kind of special treatment or push the conversation in any direction that served him. He just talked to her. He asked her questions about the clan, about the mountains, about what dragons did when the day's work was finished. Not careful questions designed to gather intelligence. Just the ordinary questions of someone who was genuinely curious about the world they had ended up in. It made Sarevin uncomfortable in a way she could not name properly. Dragon conversation had a shape. There was rank in it always. You spoke to establish something, your position, your strength, your right to take up space in the exchange. Every conversation had a direction it was pushing toward. She had been raised in that current her whole life and had learned to swim in it before she could fly. Garrett's conversation had no current. It just moved easy and without direction, and she kept finding herself in the middle of it before she had decided to get in. On the 8th day he produced 2 flat pieces of bark that he had been splitting carefully with the edge of a stone, and he had scratched a grid of markings onto each one. Card game, he said, holding them up through the bars. Human version. I'll teach you. Sarevin looked at the pieces of bark. Those are not cards. No, he agreed. But the principle is the same. The rules were simple enough. The game itself was not. Sarevin lost the first round before she had understood the middle of it. She lost the second round more slowly, which felt like progress until Garrett explained that she had been playing toward the wrong goal for the last 6 moves. She lost the third round with a clear view of exactly how she had lost it, which was in some ways worse. She came back the next afternoon. She lost 3 more times. The day after that 2 more. She started thinking about the game in the evenings when she was supposed to be doing other things. Replaying moves, finding the places where she had gone wrong, building a different approach for the next round. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. She was not sure what she would say if anyone asked why the clan heir was spending her afternoons playing a bark and stone game through the bars of a prison cell with a human prisoner. She did not have a good answer. She was not sure she needed one. She kept going. The dragon warriors who changed the watch in the lower corridor noticed, of course. They said nothing to Sarevin directly. She was the clan heir and you did not comment on the clan heir's movements unless you wanted to spend a month on the least pleasant patrol assignment available. But they talked to each other in low voices, and the talking spread, and within a week most of the stronghold knew in a general way that Sarevin was visiting the human again. More hurt. She said nothing. She was watching. On a gray morning near the end of the second week, Sarevin arrived at the lower corridor with a fresh cut along her left forearm. It had happened during morning training. A practice blade, wrong angle, her own fault for letting her attention drift. The cut was clean and not deep, but it had bled steadily and she had wrapped it loosely with a piece of cloth before coming down. She arrived at the cell and stood at the bars and Garrett looked up and immediately looked at her arm. That needs a better wrap, he said. It is fine, said Sarevin. He did not argue. He did not push. He just looked at the loose, already staining cloth and then at her face, and then he reached up and pulled the lower hem of his shirt and tore a long, clean strip from it with a single steady pull. He held it out through the bars. Sarevin looked at it. She looked at him. You will have less shirt, she said. I'll survive, he said. Come here. She stepped closer to the bars. He reached through, slowly and without any sudden movement, and unwrapped the loose cloth from her arm. He looked at the cut for a moment, the way someone looks at a thing they are assessing rather than reacting to. Then he folded the torn strip into a proper pad, pressed it firmly and evenly against the cut, and wrapped it twice around her forearm with the kind of neat efficiency that came from having done this many times before. He tucked the end under itself to hold it and let go. The whole thing had taken less than 2 minutes. He stepped back and sat down against the wall again and picked up the bark pieces for the game without making anything of what had just happened. Sarevin stood at the bars for a moment. She looked down at her arm. The wrap was clean and firm and would hold properly. Better than what she had done herself. She thought about saying something. There were several things that were true, that he had not needed to do that she could have had a healer attend to it, that a prisoner tending to a guard's wounds was not a thing that had a clear category in any rule she had been taught. She said none of them. She sat down on the stone floor outside the bars and reached through for her side of the game pieces. She lost again. She came back the next morning. That evening she sat in her quarters and looked at the wrap on her arm for a long time. It was neat and careful work. Nobody had tended her wounds before, not like that, not quietly and without being asked, not as a simple thing done because it needed doing and she was the person nearby. She did not know what to call the feeling that came with that. She had no word for it in any language she spoke. She left it unnamed and went to sleep. Thrix came back on a Tuesday. Nobody knew it was Tuesday because dragons did not count their days that way, but Garrett knew because he had been counting every day since they put him in the cell, and Tuesday was the day the whole stronghold changed its feeling without anyone saying why. He heard it first. Distant sounds, not the usual rhythm of the fortress, not the steady noise of warriors going about their work. Something heavier. Something that moved through the corridors like cold air under a door. Low voices where there were usually loud ones. Footsteps that stopped and started in ways that felt uncertain. Then silence in places that were not usually silent. Garrett sat in his cell and listened and said nothing. It was the next morning before Saravin came, and when she came she did not bring the bark game pieces and she did not sit down. She stood at the bars with her arms crossed and her eyes carrying something tight and difficult, and she looked at the wall beside him rather than at him directly. Garrett waited. "One of our patrols was hit," she said finally. "Eastern route. 6 warriors went out. 1 came back." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "How old?" he said. Saravin looked at him then. It was not the question she had expected. "What?" "The one who came back. How old?" She was still for a second. "Young. 19 seasons." Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at the floor. He did not say he was sorry because sorry was a small word for a large thing and it never quite covered the shape of what it was supposed to cover. He just nodded, and Saravin seemed to understand that the nod was carrying something real in it. She left without staying long. The young warrior's name was Thrix. Garrett learned this over the following 2 days from the fragments that came through the bars, from Saravin, from the guards who sometimes talked to each other without remembering he could hear, from the general tone of the stronghold which was its own kind of language once you learned to read it. Thrix had been physically healed by the clan's healers. His wounds were closed. His bones were sound. By every visible measure he was a warrior who had survived a bad patrol and come home intact. And in a clan that valued physical strength above most other things, intact should have meant ready. Thrix was not ready. Thrix was not anything. He sat in his quarters and did not speak. He did not eat. He did not respond to visitors in any meaningful way. He would turn his head when someone entered, show that he was aware they were there, and then turn back to whatever point on the wall he had been staring at before they arrived. His eyes were open and present and completely empty at the same time, like a room where all the furniture had been removed. The clan tried everything it knew. The elders came and performed the rites they performed when a warrior's spirit was troubled. Old words, old smoke, old gestures that had worked for other wounds in other times. Thrix sat through them without reaction. Senior warriors came and spoke to him about the honor of survival. About how the dead would want him to stand up and continue. About how grief was a thing you pushed through, not a thing you lived inside. They spoke with confidence and certainty because that was the only way they knew how to speak, and Thrix listened to none of it. The matriarch herself visited on the 3rd day. Mora stood in the doorway of Thrix's quarters for a long time, looking at the young warrior sitting motionless on his bed. She was a dragon who had answers for most things. She stood there and found that she did not have one for this, and she left without speaking. By the 4th day he had not eaten at all. The healers were worried now in a different way, not about his wounds but about something they did not have a clean name for. They reported to Mora that his body was sound but that something else was failing, and that they did not know how to reach it. That evening Saravin came to Garrett's cell and she did not stand at the bars in her usual way. She sat down on the floor of the corridor, back against the stone wall, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Garrett sat on his side of the bars and waited. "He won't eat," she said. "He won't talk. He just sits there." "Yes," said Garrett. "We have done everything." She said it without her usual steadiness. It came out flatter than she intended, and underneath the flatness there was something that sounded very much like helplessness, which was clearly a feeling she had very little experience with. "The healers have no answer. The elders have no answer. He is just gone. Somewhere we cannot reach." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me try." Saravin looked at him. "You are a prisoner." "I know. I would be breaking protocol. My mother would." "I know," he said again. "Let me try anyway." She sat with it for a moment. Then she stood up, pulled the key from the hook beside the cell door and turned the lock. Thrix's quarters were 2 levels up from the cells, in a part of the stronghold that Garrett had not seen before. Sarevin walked beside him through corridors that went quiet when people saw them. Not the threatening quiet of his first days here, but a different kind. A watching quiet. A quiet that was trying to understand what it was seeing. 2 guards stood outside Thrix's door. They looked at Sarevin with expressions that were full of questions. She met their eyes and they stepped aside without asking any of them. Inside the room was dim. One small window let in the gray late evening light. Thrix sat on the edge of his bed with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. He was young, Garrett could see that clearly now. Young and very still in the way that things are still when they are not at rest but simply stopped. Garrett came in slowly and sat down on the floor near the bed. Not beside Thrix, not close enough to crowd him. Just present. In the room. Taking up a quiet corner of the space. He said nothing. Sarevin stood near the door. The 2 guards looked in from the corridor. Everyone waited for Garrett to do something, to speak, to perform some human technique, to produce whatever it was he had come here to produce. He just sat there. A minute passed. Then another. The room stayed quiet. Thrix did not look at him, but something in the set of his shoulders changed very slightly, the way a shoulder changes when it becomes aware of company. After a long while, long enough that Sarevin had started to wonder if this had been a mistake, Garrett spoke. Quietly. The way you speak in a room where you are not trying to fill the space but just add something small to it. He said, the first time I lost people under my command I was 22. Thrix did not move. But he did not turn away either. Garrett continued. Still quiet. Still unhurried. He spoke about a river crossing on a cold morning and 4 soldiers who had trusted him and a decision he had made that he had believed was right and had turned out to be completely wrong. He spoke about walking away from that crossing alone and the way the silence of it had followed him for months afterward like a second body walking in his shadow. He spoke about the guilt. How it did not feel like sadness, it felt like weight. A constant physical pressure, like carrying something heavy with no place to set it down. He spoke about how he had stopped eating properly for a while, not as a choice but as a simple inability, because food required a kind of presence he did not have access to. He did not tell Thrix any of this was normal. He did not tell him it would pass. He did not tell him what to do or how to feel or how long things would take. He just described the shape of it. The real shape, not the cleaned-up version. The ugly, heavy, airless shape of having walked away from something that others did not walk away from. At some point Thrix's hands, which had been flat and still on his knees, curled slowly into loose fists. Then his shoulders moved. Then he was crying, not quietly, not in the contained way that people cry when they are trying to manage it, but fully with his whole body, the way something cries when it has been holding for too long and the holding simply stops working. It shook him completely. Garrett moved closer and put one hand on his shoulder and stayed exactly where he was. He did not speak. He did not move away. He just stayed. The guards in the doorway had gone very still. Sarevin stood with one hand against the doorframe and her eyes were bright in a way she would not have acknowledged if anyone had pointed it out. The crying went on for a while. Then it slowed. Then Thrix was just breathing, deep and uneven, leaning slightly toward the steadiness beside him. After a long time, one of the guards quietly left and came back with food. Thrix ate. It was not a large meal and it was not a fast one. But he picked it up and he ate it, slowly and without words, while Garrett sat beside him and said nothing more. Mora arrived at the doorway near the end of it. No one had sent for her. Someone had simply told someone who had told someone, and the information had reached her the way important things always did. She stood in the doorway and looked at the scene inside the dim room. Her youngest warrior, eating. The human prisoner, sitting beside him on the floor, quiet and still and completely unthreatening. Mora stood there for a long time. She did not say a word. The morning the Vethkar envoy arrived, the whole stronghold felt it before anyone announced it. It was in the way the guards moved, faster, tighter, with that particular kind of controlled urgency that spreads through a place when something important and unwelcome is approaching. It was in the way conversations stopped when certain people walked past. It was in the way the younger warriors found reasons to be near windows and doorways that had a view of the main gate. Garrett noticed all of it from his cell. He had learned to read the stronghold the way you learn to read weather, not from any single sign but from the combination of many small ones. The sound of boots on stone, the rhythm of the watch changes, the temperature of the silences. He had been here long enough now that the stronghold had its own grammar to him, and this morning that grammar was saying something loud and clear. Something was coming. And it was not good. Sarevin did not visit that morning. She did not visit in the afternoon either. This had not happened since the very first days of his capture, and the absence sat in the cell with him like a third presence. He ate his food. He did his exercises. He waited. The Vethkar envoy's name was Drath, and he arrived with 12 armed escorts and the particular manner of a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it began. He was large even by dragon standards, with dark gray scales and pale eyes that moved around the throne hall with the slow assessment of someone taking inventory of things he intended to eventually own. His escorts arranged themselves behind him in a precise formation. Everything about his arrival was designed to communicate one thing, that this was not a request. It was a formality before a conclusion. The throne hall was full. Mora had called the gathering herself, which meant she had known enough about what was coming to prepare for it. Every elder sat in their place along the curved stone walls. Every senior warrior stood at their post. The younger ranks filled the spaces behind them, and the hall held the low, dense murmur of many people trying to read a situation they had not been given enough information about. Garrett was brought in separately through a side door with fresh chains on his wrists. 2 guards stood close on either side of him. He was placed near the left wall, slightly apart from the main gathering, in the position of something being exhibited rather than someone attending. He stood straight and looked around the hall with the same mild attention he brought to most things. He found Saravan immediately. She was standing near the front, slightly to the right of her mother's position, in full armor. Her face was composed and still. She did not look at him, but something in the angle of her shoulders told him she knew exactly where he was. Mora entered last. The hall went fully quiet when she took her place at the head of the room. She was not a dragon who needed silence announced. She simply arrived and the silence came with her. She looked at Drath with the expression of someone who has already assessed the situation and found it less impressive than advertised. Drath stepped forward and began. He was a skilled speaker. He opened with the language of diplomacy, shared history, mutual respect, the long relationship between the clans. He spoke about the current political arrangement of the region, about alliances forming and old boundaries shifting. He spoke about the Vethkar's position in that arrangement, which he described with the careful modesty of someone describing a very large thing in deliberately small words. And then he arrived at his point. The human prisoner currently held by the Drakvas clan should be transferred to Vethkar custody. Not as a trade, there was nothing being offered in return. As a gesture. A demonstration of where the Drakvas stood in relation to the new order that was quietly and inevitably assembling itself around them. He said it smoothly and without cruelty, the way you describe the obvious. The hall was very still when he finished. Mora's face gave nothing away. She sat with the proposal the way a person sits with a stone they have just been handed, feeling the weight of it, turning it over, saying nothing yet. Garrett understood the shape of what had just happened. He had seen enough politics in enough places to recognize a trap dressed in formal language. If Mora refused, the Vethkar had their excuse for conflict. An insult, a rejection, a demonstration that the Drakvas were not cooperative. If she accepted, she handed them exactly what they wanted and signaled to every watching clan that the Drakvas could be moved. There was no clean exit. Both doors led somewhere bad. He watched Mora's face and saw her finding the same conclusion. She drew a breath. She opened her mouth. Saravan stepped forward. It was not a dramatic movement. She did not push past anyone or raise her voice or make a performance of it. She simply stepped forward from her position. One clear, deliberate step, and the hall responded to it the way a held breath responds to a sound. Every head turned. Her voice was level and completely certain. "The human is not a captive," she said. The hall was so quiet that the words carried to every corner of it without effort. "He is my chosen bondmate. He stands under sacred bond right." A brief pause. "He is clan." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The first silence had been the quiet of people waiting for something. This silence was the quiet of people who had just heard something they needed a moment to fully receive. Drath's expression moved through several stages in quick succession. The satisfied certainty he had walked in with dissolved first. Underneath it was surprise, which he controlled quickly. Underneath that was the rapid calculation of someone who had just found that the door he was walking toward had been replaced with a wall. Sacred bond right was old law. Older than the current clan structure, older than the political arrangements Drath had been describing with such comfortable authority. It could not be argued around or reframed or dissolved by diplomatic pressure. A bondmate was clan. Clan was untouchable. He knew it. Everyone in the hall knew it. The elders along the walls were very still. 2 of the senior warriors near the back had turned to look at each other with expressions that belonged on people watching something they would be telling stories about later. Mora had not moved at all. She sat in her place with her hands on the arms of her chair and her eyes on her daughter and her face showing nothing visible anyway. Then everyone turned to look at Garrett. He was already aware of being looked at. The shift in the hall's attention was a physical thing, like a change in air pressure, and it moved from Sarevin to him in the space of 2 seconds. Every eye in the room found him at once. The chained human standing near the left wall with 2 guards, the human who had apparently just become something rather different from what he had been 30 seconds ago. He looked at Sarevin. She had not turned to look at him yet. She was still facing forward, facing Drath, facing the hall, with her chin level and her shoulders set and her whole bearing carrying the complete commitment of someone who has made a decision and is standing in it. Garrett looked at her for a moment. He thought about the bark game through the bars. He thought about the card she had been dealt and the card she had just played, and the fact that she had played it here in front of everyone with no warning and no consultation and no asking. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he looked back. "She could have asked me first," he said. His voice was conversational. Not loud, but the hall was quiet enough that it carried cleanly. Several people near the front heard it directly. The ones further back heard it passed in quick whispers that moved through the room like a wave. Pause. Not a long one. But yes. The word landed in the hall and stayed there. Drath stood in the center of the room and had nothing left to stand on. His 12 escorts had the carefully neutral expressions of people trying to look uninvested in a situation that had not gone the way they had prepared for. He gathered himself with visible effort, said several formal words that amounted to nothing, and left. The great doors closed behind him. For 1 full second the hall held its breath. Then it didn't. The noise that followed was enormous, overlapping voices, the sharp sound of warriors reacting, the lower rumble of elders, the strange compressed energy of a room full of people who had just witnessed something they could not quite categorize. Garrett stood in his chains and listened to it. Sarevin found him afterward in the side corridor, where the guards had taken him to wait while the hall cleared. She came around the corner and stopped a few feet away from him and looked at him with an expression that was prepared for several possible reactions. He was leaning against the wall with his arms folded, looking at her with something patient and clear. She said nothing. Waiting. "So," he said, "what exactly does a bondmate do around here?" Sarevin looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something that was not quite relief but lived in the same neighborhood. "I will explain," she said. "Take your time," said Garrett. "I'm not going anywhere." The chains came off 3 days after the throne hall. Mora gave the order without ceremony, a single word to the head guard passed down through the watch, and that was that. No announcement. No formal moment. Just a guard arriving at Garrett's cell one morning with a key and an expression that suggested he had been given instructions he did not entirely understand but was following anyway. Garrett rubbed his wrists once, picked up the small folded bark bird from the corner of his cell, and walked out. He was given a room in the lower warrior quarters. Small, stone, with a narrow window and a wooden bed frame and a chest for belongings. He had no belongings, so the chest stayed empty. He did not complain about this. He put the bark bird on the windowsill and went to find out what was expected of him. What was expected of him, it turned out, was not entirely clear to anyone. The bond declaration had changed his status in law, but law and daily reality were 2 different countries, and the distance between them was populated entirely by dragons who were not sure what to do with a human walking free in their stronghold. Most of them settled on watching him. Not threateningly, or not only threateningly, but with the specific attention of people waiting to see what a new and unfamiliar thing would do next. Garrett went to work. He helped with whatever needed doing. He assisted with supply inventory when he saw it was behind. He fixed a gate hinge that had been stiff for what looked like months, using nothing but a stone, a piece of wire, and about 40 minutes of patient work. He helped 2 younger dragons carry a load of timber that had been blocking a corridor since a delivery had gone wrong. He did all of this without being asked, without drawing attention to himself, and without expecting acknowledgement. He received very little acknowledgement. That was fine. He kept going. The one who watched him most carefully and most openly was Drock. Drock was a veteran. He had been a warrior for longer than most of the younger clan members had been alive, and he wore that time on him visibly, in the scarring along his jaw, in the way he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had survived enough things to stop being surprised by them. He was respected in the clan in the particular way that blunt and reliable things are respected. Not loudly. Just consistently. He had been against Garrett's new status from the first day. He had not said this in a dramatic speech or made demands of the matriarch. He had simply made his position known through the economy of his expressions and the precise way he positioned himself whenever Garrett was in a room, always at an angle, always watchful, always carrying the posture of someone who had formed a judgment and was waiting for evidence to confirm it. He watched Garrett fix the gate hinge and said nothing. He watched Garrett work through 3 days of supply inventory without complaint and said nothing. He watched Garrett help the younger warriors with the timber and said nothing. But Garrett could feel the watching the way you feel weather changing, not dramatic, just constant, just present. He did not try to win Drock over. He understood, in the practical way of someone who had spent years earning trust in difficult places, that the only currency Drock would accept was behavior over time. Words meant nothing to a dragon like that. Performance meant something. Not performance in the showy sense, Drock would see through that immediately, but the steady, undramatic performance of a person simply being what they said they were, day after day without needing it to be noticed. So Garrett worked and waited and gave Drock nothing to confirm his suspicions, and the watching continued. The patrol assignment came at the end of the first week. Saravin arranged it, a joint patrol on the eastern route, a mixed group of 8 warriors including 2 of the senior fighters and several younger ones still building their experience. It was a real assignment, not a test dressed up as one, covering 12 miles of border territory that had been quiet for months but warranted regular checking. Garrett was included without particular announcement. His name appeared on the list. He showed up at the gate at the appointed time with the blade he had been issued and a pack with the same provisions as everyone else. Drock was also on the list. They did not speak on the way out. The patrol moved at a steady pace through the mountain passes and down into the lower forest territory, and Garrett walked with the group and paid attention to the terrain the way he always paid attention to terrain, quietly and continuously, building a picture of it without seeming to. The eastern forest was dense and old, with heavy tree cover and uneven ground that broke sight lines every 30 feet. Good country for ambushes. Garrett had noted 3 positions in the first mile that he would have used if he were on the other side of this patrol. He noted them and said nothing and kept walking. They were 6 miles out when it happened. It was well planned. The Vethkar scouts had been patient and they had chosen their ground carefully. A narrow section of the path where the tree line pressed close on both sides and a shallow ridge gave elevated position to anyone who had arrived there first. The patrol walked into it before the lead warrior had time to react, and within the first 10 seconds 2 things happened simultaneously. 2 dragons took injuries from the opening exchange, and the path back the way they had come was cut off by a second group emerging from the tree line behind them. Panic moved through the group like fire through dry grass. Not cowardice, these were trained warriors, but the particular disorientation that hits any unit when the situation changes faster than the mind can process it. Everyone was reacting. Nobody was thinking. Garrett was already thinking. He had seen the ridge on the way in. He had seen the tree line pressure. He had noted the narrow section of path 3 minutes before they reached it and had felt something in his chest go quiet and alert the way it always did when ground felt wrong. He moved to the center of the group and did not shout. He spoke at exactly the volume required to be heard over the noise. Not loud, not soft, just present and clear the way a voice needs to be when it is carrying information that matters. 2 injured to the rear left, that hollow behind the gray stones, get them there now. He pointed without looking, his eyes already moving to the ridge. 3 of you take the eastern tree line at the base, not the top, the base, stay below their angle. You 2 hold the path center, weapons forward, don't advance. Nobody moved for 1 second. Then everybody moved. It was not that the warriors simply obeyed a human's orders. It was that the orders were right, and experienced fighters can feel when orders are right the way they can feel solid ground under their feet. The instructions had the quality of someone who had read the ground before the ground had introduced itself. Garrett picked up a second blade from the pack of one of the injured warriors and went to the eastern flank himself. The position where the ridge angle was sharpest and the patrol's exposure was worst. The position nobody wanted to hold alone. He held it. What followed was not brief and it was not clean. It was the kind of fighting that happens in close country with uneven numbers, loud and fast and full of decisions that had to be made before there was time to finish making them. Garrett moved through it with the focused economy of someone operating at the outer edge of what they were capable of and knowing it. The Vethkar scouts had not planned for the patrol to reorganize that quickly. The window they needed closed before they could use it. Within 12 minutes the engagement had broken. The scouts pulling back, the patrol regrouped and breathing hard in the narrow path. Everyone was standing. Garrett stood at the eastern position and looked at the empty ridge line for a moment. Then he became aware that his blade was on the ground. He had dropped it at some point, he did not remember exactly when, and had not noticed yet. He reached for it. Drock was already there. The old warrior picked the blade up from the ground. He stood with it for a moment, looking at it, and then he turned and held it out to Garrett with the handle first. He said nothing. His eyes said everything. Not warmth, Drak was not a warm man and probably never had been. But something that sat just below respect and was in the process of becoming it. The look of someone who had formed a judgment and had just found, cleanly and without room for argument, that the judgment had been wrong. Garrett took the blade. Drak turned away without ceremony and went to check on the injured. That night the patrol made camp before heading back, and around the fire the warriors began to talk. Not formally. Not as a report. The way warriors talk when the danger has passed and the story is still warm, loose and honest and full of the specific details that only people who were there would know to include. Garrett sat at the edge of the fire and listened. His name was in the story. The gathering was called at sunset. Not midday, not morning, sunset, which Garrett had learned was the time the Drakvas clan used for things that mattered. Midday was for work. Morning was for war. Sunset was for the things that needed to be witnessed properly, with the sky doing something worth looking at overhead and the day's noise settling into the kind of quiet that made words carry further. Word moved through the stronghold in the afternoon, and by the time the light had started turning the stone walls amber, everyone was moving toward the main courtyard without being told twice. Garrett watched it from his window in the lower warrior quarters, the steady flow of dragons through the corridors below, armor on, heads up, the particular purposeful movement of a clan answering a summons from its matriarch. Saravin came to his door. She was in full ceremonial armor, darker than her usual gear, older-looking, with markings along the shoulders that Garrett had not seen before. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with an expression that was carefully composed, the way a face is carefully composed when the person wearing it is doing deliberate work to keep it that way. "It is time," she said. Garrett picked up his blade from the window ledge, the same one Drak had handed back to him handle first 3 days ago, and put it at his belt. He had kept it there since. He looked at Saravin for a moment, at the careful composition of her face, and decided not to say anything about it yet. "Lead the way," he said. The courtyard was full. Every member of the Drakvas clan who was present in the stronghold had come, warriors, elders, healers, the young ones who were still in training, the older ones who had retired from active duty but never really left. They arranged themselves in the loose curved shape that Garrett had seen them use for important gatherings, with the senior ranks at the front and the younger ones filling in behind, and the whole thing had the weight of something that had been done this way for a very long time. Torches had been lit along the walls even though the sun had not fully set yet. The sky above was doing exactly what a sunset sky is supposed to do, deep red at the edges fading up through orange into a high clear blue that still held the last of the day in it. The volcanic peaks behind the stronghold caught the color and held it. Garrett stood beside Saravin near the front. He was aware of being looked at, which was not a new experience inside these walls, but this was a different quality of attention than the watchful suspicion of his early weeks or the careful assessment of his middle ones. This was the attention of people who were present for something and understood they were present for something. It was not hostile. It was not entirely comfortable either. It was simply the full, gathered weight of a clan looking at a thing that was about to be made official. Mora arrived last. She came through the main doors of the stronghold and crossed the courtyard without hurrying, and the crowd moved to give her space the way water moves around a stone. She was not wearing ceremonial armor. She was wearing her ordinary clothes, the dark practical gear of a matriarch who runs things rather than represents them, and somehow that made her more imposing than ceremony would have. She stopped at the center of the courtyard and looked around at her clan for a moment. Just looked, taking in the faces, the ranks, the full picture of what had assembled. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud but it carried completely, the way voices carry in stone spaces when the person speaking knows how to use them. She said that the status of captive, granted to the human Garrett upon his capture at the eastern border, was dissolved. Fully and permanently. Not suspended, not conditionally lifted, dissolved. Gone. As if it had never been. She said it in the formal language that clan law required, the old words that made things real in the way that only very old words can, and when she finished saying them the air in the courtyard felt different in a way that was not quite explainable but was felt by everyone present. Then she paused. In Garrett's experience, the pauses of people who had something real to say were different from the pauses of people managing a performance. Mora's pause was the first kind. She was finding the right words for something she had been turning over in her mind for some time. She looked out at the clan and said, "We thought we had captured a human warrior." Her voice was even, unhurried. The courtyard was absolutely still. "We put him in a stone cell and waited for him to break. He did not break." She let that sit for a moment. "We sent our best warrior to assess him." She kept going back. Another pause, shorter. We brought him to our most wounded and he reached what we could not reach. We brought him to our most dangerous moment and he held what we could not hold. She looked at Garrett directly then. He met her eyes and held them. We were wrong, she said. He was never our prisoner. The faintest pause. We were his. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a sound at all. But something moved through the assembled clan. Not a noise, not a movement, but the feeling of a large group of people arriving at the same understanding at the same moment. The slow recognition of a truth that had been visible for some time but had needed someone to say it aloud before it could be fully received. Drock was standing near the front. His face was its usual unreadable self. But he nodded once, a single small nod, and looked forward again. Then Mora called Garrett to the center. He walked forward and stood before her and she placed 2 fingers on his forehead and spoke the words of the clan mark right in the oldest dialect the clan used, the one so old that even some of the elders only partly understood it. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. When it was done she stepped back and looked at him with the expression of someone who has finished a thing they had been considering for a while and found the finishing of it correct. Around his wrist, drawn in the dark ceremonial ink that the clan's elder had prepared that afternoon, was the clan mark. Not a tattoo. It would not last forever in that form. But it would be renewed. It had been placed and placing was what mattered. The clan made noise then. Not the polite noise of an official gathering acknowledging a formal moment. Real noise, the deep collective sound of a group of people who felt something and were not pretending otherwise. The younger warriors in the back were loudest. Thrix, standing near the middle of the crowd, was not making noise but he was standing straight and his eyes were clear and alive in a way they had not been 2 weeks ago. Garrett stood in the center of the courtyard and let it wash over him without performing anything in response to it. He just stood there and received it and that was enough. The gathering moved toward the fire after that, the large central fire that the clan built for evenings that deserved one, and the formal structure of the ceremony dissolved into the looser, warmer shape of a clan at rest. Food appeared. Voices rose and crossed each other. The sky above had gone full dark and the peaks behind the stronghold were lit from below by the fire's reach and the torches along the walls. Saravin found him at the edge of the firelight. She had been composed through the entire ceremony. Every second of it, the formal words, the clan mark, the noise of the gathered clan, all of it, she had stood straight and steady in her ceremonial armor and worn the face of a clan heir who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Now the ceremony was over and the crowd was moving and nobody was particularly watching, and she stood beside him at the edge of the light and was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than a comfortable quiet. Garrett waited. I should have asked you, she said. Not loudly. Just the 2 of them, the fire noise covering everything beyond a few feet. Before the throne hall. I should have asked you properly instead of simply declaring it in front of everyone. Garrett looked at her. I know, he said. I did not ask because, she stopped. Started again. I was afraid you would say no. She said it simply and directly, which he suspected cost her more than it sounded like it cost her. Saravin was not a person who found it easy to say the thing underneath the thing. She had layers of composure built up over a long time and they served her well and she was using none of them right now. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the careful honesty on her face, at the fire reflecting in her golden eyes, at the clan moving warm and loud behind her, at the stronghold rising solid and dark into the lit sky, at everything that had begun with a stone cell and a cold floor and a man who had decided that falling apart helped nothing. He said, I was never going to say no. She looked at him. Something in her face that had been held carefully for a very long time became, quietly and without drama, unheld. Above the stronghold the fire climbed the dark sky and the peaks caught the light and held it, and the clan of the Drakvas was loud and warm around them, and Garrett stood at the edge of all of it and felt, with the simple and complete certainty of a thing that has stopped moving because it has arrived, that he was home. They had chained a human to break him. Instead he had walked, calm and unhurried and completely himself, straight into the heart of them. And somewhere along the way without anyone quite noticing, he had made it home.